So welcome everybody. Today we have our Dr. Dena Huisman from Communication Study, and we will be talking about you are what you speak, everyday interactions, and how they make us who we are. So we communicate through emails. Basically, we want to talk about things in 5 categories, and let's start with gender.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so like setting the stage, I guess, a bit, what I think about and what I teach about is that in most of our lived experience, our reality is created through the language that we have at our disposal to describe it. And so with things like gender, I teach a whole class on gender communication. We talk a lot about how just the everyday words that we use as part of a gender code, as well as just general words, help us to understand what it means to be a gendered person.
Can you give us an example of those kind of words like gender code?
Yes. Okay, so for example, if the easiest one I would say is pretty and handsome. If you look up pretty or handsome, the dictionary doesn't say pretty can only be used for a woman and handsome can only be used for a man. But we know when we use those words that it's triggering a gender expectation. So if I call a man a pretty boy, we know that that's an insult because pretty is a word that's small, it's diminutive, pleasing, and something that only is used for a girl. If a woman is called handsome, it's not really an insult, but it's speaking to a particular kind of attractiveness that may not be as ideal as
the masculine.
Pretty, right? It might be that she's tall and that she's handsome because she's tall, or she's handsome because she's got nice features, but they're not pretty. So that's one of the ways that we do that. We also have in derogatory language the way that we pinpoint expected behaviors for gender, which aren't at all tied to our biology. They're just tied to what we socially expect. We see that there are a lot more derogatory words for women related to their sexual availability, for example. So there's a study, this is a little bit older of a study, but I use it all the time still, where a professor asked her students to come up with all the derogatory words that they could think of to describe people by gender. And the codes for women were that they were either too sexually available, slut, that kind of thing, not sexual enough, frigid, or they were the wrong kind of sexual, meaning that they were interested in sex with women rather than men. So what we're seeing there is that women are described sexually based on how accessible they are to men.
Okay.
And I think that kind of, you see that writ large in our culture, the idea that women are supposed to be sexually attractive. That's their most important feature, that kind of thing. And the other categories for women in derogatory language were words that implied she was mean, but specifically mean toward men. Ball breaker, battle axe, all of those kinds of things, which imply, again, that her identity is based on how she relates to men. And there aren't really very many that describe men that do that. So men can be described as too sexual, but those words are also, in some context, positive. Like ladies' man is seen as, he's really successful with the ladies. He's a cad, maybe describes a man who's not a polite man to a woman. But there aren't the same kind of categorizations of men's availability to women as a sexual person. We also see that words for women that imply she's stupid are often words that kind of imply she's empty-headed, bubble brain, airhead, ditz. But for men it's usually it's just that there's the wrong thing in their head. So swear here, shit for brains, right? So it's not that he's empty-headed, it's just that he has the wrong stuff in his head. So looking at all of these ways that we just use everyday language that mark gendered people to be the way the power structure tells us we should be. You have other things like the kind of diminutive endings, the endings that imply femininity. So you have an actor, which if you just look up actor in the dictionary, it says a person who performs on stage. It doesn't say a man, but we use it for a man because an actress is a woman who does the work of an actor. So it's little things like that. And in all of our daily language, we have that, words that describe women are fine for women and terrifying for men. And words that define men are sometimes acceptable for
Mm-hmm.
women to be called as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay for a woman to be more like a man than it is for a man to be more like a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've seen Meet the Parents, it's getting to be kind of old now, but there's a scene where Ben Stiller's character talks about why he chose to be a nurse. But he's not just a nurse, he's a male nurse,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because nurse is female unless you mark it as male. And he gets made fun of, like, why didn't you go to be a doctor? Why wouldn't you go be a doctor, go to medical school, be a doctor? Women don't experience that. If they choose to be a nurse, they're like, oh, great, you're going to be a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that gendered? Why is our language automatically assumptive that nurse means woman?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. So,
Okay.
I talk a lot about that. We talk about toxic masculinity a lot in my class, and the kind of vocabulary and behavior expectations for men to be really hyper masculine, that having really big muscles is a sign of your worth,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of thing. And for women, being smaller, dainty, is a sign of their worth.
So that ties back to the physical health and
Yeah,
physical appearance
absolutely.
we're going to talk about later, right?
Okay, yep, absolutely.
That's awesome. So are you trying to say, like, so basically our language kind of project our expectations of binary genders, right?
It reflects and creates. I think I would take it that step further. Our language creates our expectation, and then we use that language in ways that represent
Mm-hmm.
that truth that we think, and then it just continues to get reinforced until we step back and challenge it.
Okay.
So another example that I think talks about how language creates experience, we have had for as long as women have been in the world, sexual harassment.
Mm-hmm.
That's been a thing since people. But until the 70s, there wasn't a word or term sexual harassment. And so women who were in the workplace who experienced things that we would call sexual harassment didn't really know that it wasn't acceptable, and they didn't really know that there was anything they could do about it.
Mm-hmm.
So once feminists in the 70s said, there's this thing happening and we're going to call it sexual harassment, and it's going to be a thing that we're going to label as a behavior that has a meaning that we no longer accept and that we're going to fight, that we started creating this idea that workplaces should be safe for women.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that tangible reality doesn't exist, it's just that we don't see it or hear it or experience it until we have language to create a kind of meaning for it.
It's almost like a psychological developmental process. It's like you act out first.
Yes.
You see all the problem. You see enough problems. You start to have myth, ritual, and all this kind of stuff. And
Yes.
someday you just start to rationalize everything, and then suddenly you have a cognition. You have an understanding of what's
Yep.
going on, and
Yep.
then you define it with language.
Yes.
And starting from there, since the behavior is already there,
Mm-hmm.
before you define the language, but now with the language you make that thing more classified,
It's made
categorized.
sensible to
Yeah.
us.
Mhm.
Yeah. And even more than that, like, so social constructionism, this kind of theory that I use in all of my classes to talk about this stuff, originated in social psychology.
Mhm.
And then now it's used across all kinds of social science fields. Oh, shoot, I just lost what I was going to say about that.
Words are powerful, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I know. So the other aspect of this, of why I think interpersonal communication is so important, when things like sexual harassment became a thing that we labeled, it depended on women getting together and having conversations face to face, saying, are you experiencing getting slapped on the ass at work? Are you experiencing your boss talk to you in ways that make you feel uncomfortable?
Mhm.
Saying, yes, oh my gosh, I experienced that too. And it was through that kind of consciousness raising, through interpersonal and small group dynamics, that it can be something. Otherwise, we're just these isolated people who don't think anyone else experiences the things that we're experiencing. And there's no label for it.
That's why freedom of speech. You need to
Yeah.
call out for actions. You need
Yes.
to speak out what
Absolutely.
you're doing, right?
And
Okay.
yeah, and you need, I think, before you can do the free speech stuff, before you can really go out there and do the public component of that, you need to find some folks and you need to have kind of some heart-to-heart conversations. How do I make sense of what's happening? What can I say about it? How can I say it safely and protect myself? Because, especially for those first women coming out with sexual harassment, there was a lot of risk.
Yeah.
Because the boss would just be like, oh, well, then you're fired, bye.
Mhm.
So you had to do a lot of that.
Especially at the beginning,
work.
when you try to
Mhm.
define the terms for the whole society,
Yeah.
there is a chance that you fight and you fail.
Right.
What are you going to do after that?
Right.
Now,
if I
even if
fail,
you-
what's next?
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
even if sexual harassment is a thing, you say it out. Still, you're
Yeah.
risking a different kind of risk. But yeah,
Yep.
it's hard.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Yeah. And it's difficult when, women too are expected to dress both chastely and modestly, but also sexily. Right? Sexily, I don't know if that's a word, but I'm going to make it in one because I'm creating words.
I'm from
That's what
China.
I'm
I
doing.
hear this. I feel comfortable.
It
Just
feels
like,
fine? Okay, good.
yeah.
All right.
Or sexility.
Sexility. Ooh, we should find a meaning for that, sexility. And so women are in this double bind of you're supposed to be sexually available, but if you're sexually available, then, maybe you asked for that sexual harassment. Maybe you shouldn't have worn that skirt quite so short. But if you wear a really long skirt, then what are you, frigid?
Makes sense.
Be a woman, all right?
Yeah. So you're judging, or like the society, not just the men, right? Are judging women from the male point of view.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's something that I continually reflect on in my own thinking. How am I part of this sort of patriarchal structure? How am I judging women by the standards that men judge women? And how do I stop doing that? How do I find language that lifts women up? And when I disagree with what a woman's doing, how do I do it without it being in that sort of gendered male expectation sort of way?
So let's take this thing from the other side. I'm just trying to do a mind game here, right? So do you also feel like this kind of words towards women specifically can also apply to men, but from a different perspective? It's just like, hey, if you're a good guy, tough up.
Right.
Like,
yes.
Right. And if you don't have a job, if you're a woman, we're kind of saying, hey, different expectation there because your social roles are different. So do you experience the same thing with men?
Yes,
towards
I
men?
do. And we talk about that in class too. I don't, I'm teaching a gender studies class, not a women only class, right? Yeah. So we do talk about that. I think that men do have more social power in our society, but I do think that that social power is a double-edged sword. Like you say, with that sort of hyper-masculinity, if you're not man enough, then you're like a woman. Well, that's insulting to women, but it's also insulting to the man.
Yeah.
The idea that you have to make more money as a man to be successful, you have to have more muscles in order to be successful.
Even if the woman is making a lot of money, they still expect, like they're super successful lawyers, female lawyers, they still expect, right? The other half should make more money than I do.
Yes.
Which make it really hard for them to actually find mate.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're judging your masculine worth by making more money than a woman, or by being taller than a woman, or a woman saying that I have to be shorter than the man, kind of a thing. It's not benefiting anyone, ultimately. Today in my class, my theory class, one of the students was talking about gender scripts and things like that. And she played a song by Brad Paisley called I'm a Guy, or Thank God I'm a Guy, I don't remember the name of it. But in it, he talks about how I'm not feminized. I don't use lotion to have creamy, soft hands. It's like, is using lotion only for girls? I did not know that men have to have rough, scaly hands in order to be the right kind of masculine. And, I don't do stuff to my hair because I'm a man. I don't use products in my hair because I'm a man. Like, what? Weirdness is that? And what does it gain a man by saying, oh, I can't use lotion on my hands because only girls do that? Like, that's a stupid one, but it's also, like, that's so prevalent. The idea that being a man means you can't have any sort of softness, you can't have any sort of emotion, you can't have any kind of human connection beyond, hey, bros up. That's not affection, that's just, hey, bros up. I think everybody needs connection to other people, and they need to have a close bonding relationship. And I think our society doesn't allow men easy access to that because it'll look too feminine.
Interesting, because from my perspective, every single person is a combination of two, right? The female side or the feminine side and the masculine side. You can lean in more towards the masculine side if you're male, but you still need to have the feminine side, like agreeableness, like dealing with people, all this kind of stuff. So, it's actually really interesting to see the language actually put the barrier on, like, basically be yourself, right?
Yeah, be yourself as long as what yourself means is lining up with those
It's okay to have both sides, and you should have both sides.
And
right?
we've constructed, and if you look back in the 19th century and before, masculine friendship was extremely close. Men were expected to have really, really tight male companionship where they could talk about deep things and they could be affectionate with one another physically.
Yeah.
There are photo collections of, when photography was new, of male friends going in and having their photo taken, and they're like on each other's laps and their arms are around each other. They, by modern standards, you would assume that they were a same-sex couple.
Yep.
But they're not. They're just friends. But now, in modern society, we've just sort of taken that away. But you're right. There is still that feminine side need. Well, we call it feminine, but it's not. It's just the need for friendship.
Yeah.
That
Okay.
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing we talk about gender, right?
Mhm.
The second thing, can you elaborate on how words does it impact on our mental health?
Mental health.
Yep.
Yeah. This
I think
is
that's
an
a very,
important one.
very good one.
Yeah, this is really important to me. I live my life as a person with depression and anxiety, so I care about nothing and everything all at once. It's kind of a clash, but it's there. I experience it every day of my life, and I always have to think carefully about whether I tell people that, or I used to think carefully, because when you talk about mental illness, people already or automatically assume less than, or they assume, crazy,
Yep.
and that, you're not going to be as good at your job, you're going to be, moody and disagreeable, and, if you have something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, that you can't be trusted, that you're a bad person, that you're violent, that you're a misfit, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that all of our words in society that we use to describe mental illness are also used in general context to just describe bad things. I've worked really hard to stop using the word crazy. I still do because it just comes out sometimes. But when you say, oh, that's crazy, what you're saying is that that's a word that historically has meant somebody with a mental illness, and it marginalizes their humanity by saying this thing that's happening is bad, like you're bad, because you have a mental illness, right?
So normal people can have mental health problem. It's not like when you
Yes.
have mental health
Yes.
problem, you're a bad person in
Right.
general, right?
Right.
Everything you do is bad because you have mental problem.
Right.
It's just like when we got a flu, big deal.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And, having a chemical imbalance in my brain means I have a chemical imbalance in my brain.
If I know how to treat it,
But, right.
if I know how to,
Right.
just like when I got a flu, I take a hot water, I just sleep at night.
Yep.
Today I just don't feel all right today. Because for me, I see this a lot. It's just like people don't pay so much attention to their mental health as
Yes.
they pay to physical health,
Yep.
right? So let's say you got a flu today. What are you going to do? Well, certainly you're going to see the doctor,
Yep.
take a flu shot, or just
Yep.
rest a little bit until you recover, right? You're not going to say, hey, I got a flu, but that's no big
Yeah.
deal.
Right.
I'm going to do my homework until 2 weeks later. Suddenly you got something more severe, right?
Right. Yeah.
But if you got depression today, big deal. I'm going to work until you start to realize, okay, I cannot focus. My mind is not working.
Yep.
Now you start to see a doctor, and suddenly you have symptoms.
Yeah.
Right, and that's actually
Yeah.
very severe. So I really think if possible, we could tell people or just train people a little bit or acknowledge them a little bit on how to treat yourself
Yeah.
when you have mental health problems.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to
Absolutely.
be go to a therapist because it's
Yep.
not that severe,
Yeah.
but you can have low time, right?
And yeah, I do go to a therapist every 3 weeks or so, and it's really helped me. I think this is a common thing for academics. The imposter syndrome plays into my depression, where I assume that I'm terrible at everything. And so then I get down in that thought bog of I make everything huge. So I didn't understand this one thing, which means I'm too stupid to be a professor, which means I'm too stupid to be at this university, which means I'm too stupid to be a person,
Yep.
Everything gets really big really fast. But you're right, having the vocabulary, first of all, to say this is depression. It's not that I'm a terrible person. I have a word that I can use to label myself in a way that doesn't diminish my humanity. It gives me something to point to. And my therapist always says, like, personify your depression. Make it into a monster so that you can see it and, like, sense it there, so that when you're having these thoughts that just sort of feel like bad thoughts, you're thinking about that monster and talking to that monster about, like, yeah, you're wrong about that.
Face your fear
depressive
instead of
thought.
running away.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, depression monster, I'm not broken. I'm actually just really sad, and you're trying to make it worse, but no thanks, So having that label, and also, again, knowing that other people experience it is hugely important. And so when we don't talk about it, when we aren't allowed to express in language what our depression feels like, or our schizophrenia, or our
Yep.
bipolar, we feel isolated and alone. So it's the same as that sexual harassment thing. You have to have people who are willing to talk about it in order to fully understand it yourself. Even though everyone's experience is different, there are those overlapping things that if we are able to talk about it in our relationships and able to talk about it publicly, then everybody benefits ultimately.
That's
So
actually a
that
big thing,
stigma is that the stigma we've created, the lack of language we've created, makes everyone's life worse.
Mm-hmm.
It also ties back to gender, because women, being emotional, are more allowed to talk about it, and that's another area where women have more privilege in that situation. I think it's okay for me to talk about having an emotional block or barrier, but for men,
It's harder. Yeah.
it's a lot harder. And that's, so all these statistics say women experience depression at such and such a level higher than men, and I think the reality is that men just don't talk about it.
It's possible.
They're not allowed.
It's possible.
Since I've started talking about my own depression, several men who are close to me have said, "Oh yeah, I went on antidepressants. It was really hard." And I'm like, "What?" Would have helped for me to have known that before. Like, "Oh, well, yeah, I can't talk about it." And these are really great people who have every right to talk about it.
I think the thing here is number one. Like, what's the most relief thing when you go to a doctor? Doctor says, "Oh, your thing is common. 90% of people
Right.
has that." That's
Yes.
I thought it's just me.
Yeah.
Is it cancer or some new disease? The worst
Right.
case you want to hear is actually the doctor say, "Hey, wait a second, I've never seen this before." Right?
Ooh, you're that person.
So the moment
Yeah.
you see like, well, people with age more
Yeah.
than 30 tend to get this, more than 60% of them get this, you just have a big
Yeah.
relief, right? I'm
Yep,
common.
absolutely.
The second thing, which is really interesting, it's actually the same thing about gender or mental health or even race in general. I kind of feel like, let's say you got sexual harassment or you got mental health. The recommendation I received, or no matter from which side, is go find a professional.
Yes.
Don't talk it with your student. Don't talk about it with your
Right.
friends. Don't talk about it with your professors. Do you think that thing is helping? Or do you think actually this should be, especially for people who do not have a very serious right thing? It's more
Right.
about like, yeah, it just happened today, I'm not comfortable. But once I
Right.
say it, I report it to HR,
Right.
that's going to be a big deal.
Yes.
Everybody's going to know about it. And after that, how am I supposed to work here?
Yes.
Right? So,
Yes. And that I have been criticized for talking about my own mental health stuff because it's seen as not professional by a few people.
yeah.
I've decided that I don't care. And I have the power. I'm a tenured, promoted professor. They're not going to be able to fire me because I talked about my depression. So that's definitely part of my privilege. But what I would say is it's not professional because we've decided as a culture it's not professional. It's not because it's not professional.
Mm-hmm.
We've just decided that.
Yep.
And if we choose to reject that idea, then everyone can talk about it and there won't be that risk of, oh my gosh, I can't work here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Why should I have to feel like I can't work here if people know that I have bipolar disorder?
Mm-hmm.
Why should I not be able to work here because of that?
Yeah.
Why should I feel threatened by the people around me because of this thing that just lives in me? And it's like you said, if I got diagnosed with cancer, nobody would be like, oh, you really can't work here anymore.
Or even just regular
Or-
things like, I got small
Yeah.
feet. So,
Right.
like,
Or,
that's not normal,
you know,
but small feet. It's
Yeah.
just small feet or small hands.
Or like my mom had eczema,
Uh-huh.
which is a skin thing where her hands peeled. She couldn't help it. It's just part of her body,
Yeah.
and she hated it.
But I mean,
But-
I can still do the job. I
Yeah,
do.
she
And
still
people
does
still
the
love
job.
me. I have
Right.
personality, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I'm capable and I'm competent, and lots of people who are living with lots of very impactful mental illnesses are still out there doing their jobs. They're still being productive citizens.
Mhm.
They're not harming anybody in any way. So for me, there are people for whom it is still a risk, and I would advise them to be careful with revealing it if it is going to lead to them being fired.
Yeah.
But I also want them to recognize that that's other people's problem, not yours. Like,
Yeah.
you shouldn't feel ashamed. Don't let those people make you feel ashamed. Keep yourself safe, but don't buy into that discourse that it shouldn't be talked about.
I kind of feel like if you talk about more, people will know it's not a big deal.
Mhm.
Because now
Exactly.
you don't hear a word about you have a mental health. You just heard from HR. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Some guy there has a mental health. you throw out some terms. Nobody knows what the term means.
Mm-hmm.
They just say, wow, stay away from him or
Right.
something like that, right?
Dangerous.
But actually, if you just talk with him, you find, oh, he just tends to talk fast. Sometimes when he,
Right,
got
he's
excited,
nervous
or
or-
he just become
yeah.
nervous sometimes. Just, oh, that's what the
just part of
terminology
the-
means, and I know him. So this is it's almost like that's can become part of your personality instead of like your mental problem, right?
Right.
So I kind of feel that way.
Right.
But yeah, as I said, with race, with gender, and with mental health, it's just I feel like if you talk about it, that means you're ready to make a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
Or you just simply
Yeah.
just swallow the whole thing, just like, yeah, he slapped on my butt, for example. Like, do I want to make a big deal out of it? Because if I go to HR, they're going to make a case, they're going to make a report. He needs to actually apologize to me publicly, or I just need to be gone.
Right.
I better just swallow that thing.
Right. And ultimately, everybody can make their choice of how they want to handle things.
Hopefully.
All of that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, within the barrier of what society lets, but there are so many structures that make some of our rights to act feel impossible to act. And it's not because those things are real, it's because those things are constructed for us.
They're almost like a shadow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a French philosopher, he's dead now, his name is Michel Foucault, and we just talked about him in my class too. He talks about how power isn't a hierarchical thing. Power isn't, a few old white dudes smoking cigars in a boardroom telling everyone else what to do. That we are all part of the power structure, and we engage in that power structure every day by the choices that we make to communicate or not communicate. And so we observe each other and judge each other, and that's all that power needs. It just needs us to cooperate with it.
Yeah, that's a classic postmodernist point of view.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
The whole panopticon thing, like we're all watching each other and judging each other and keeping everybody in line with what we have learned is the way that you stay in line.
It's almost like our nation is built on that. Citizens basically watch each other, so the government doesn't have to.
Yep.
Right. So.
Yep.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's like the classic example he uses of prison guards and prisoners. The assumption is that the prison guards have all the power, but the reality is the prison guards depend on the prisoners accepting that power.
Yep.
Otherwise, you have a riot.
You got one person. They got I don't know. Think about how much power, real power you have.
Yeah. Ultimately,
it's just we have more people as prisoners, much more. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and we're kind of the prisoners of our own cultural scripts, our own language.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's the negative way to look at it.
So we got gender and mental health. So far, I think I start to see how communication words can start to make impact on the culture and everything.
Yep, language and action.
Almost feel like if you start to use a certain language, like with a very small group of people, until this thing start to grow and like that, and then is this kind of like a classic development process? It's just like a small group of people, they just enlightened, right? For a while, and then they start to define those kind of languages, and they actually go bottom up to eventually make the whole society change.
Yeah.
Is this like a cycle? How we created the power structure, how we created the political environment and our culture, basically.
Yeah, I think probably it's. I wouldn't call it like a systemic or systematic process.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's so haphazard and it's so random chance, and I think a lot of things emerge and grow just out of the natural expression of things, not because there's a group of people who try to make things grow, but a group of people just start talking about it, and they start to do something in their own world to make the change for themselves, and then that catches and other people see it, and
so spread and echo, right? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just more of a natural progression of other people saying, oh, that really makes me mad too. I'm going to try that in my own life. And then enough people start doing it that it becomes a norm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I start to see how powerful language can be.
Yeah.
Right? So let's talk about the third thing, which is physical health and bodies. So let's explore how we identify healthy bodies and beautiful bodies, being fat as a social construct, and how what we communicate as a healthy body is often an undernourished body, which I totally agree. Yeah. But what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, a million things actually. And this is where in communication studies we talk a lot about language, but we talk a lot too about nonverbal communication and how our bodies and our expressions say a lot as well. And, the word fat, for example, and there are a couple of scholars on campus who overtly do this kind of research work talking about fat as a social construct. The idea of what is fat has, first of all, changed dramatically over the years. If you look at, the classic Rubens paintings from 1600s, 1700s, I probably should look that up, but I didn't. Those women, by our standards today, were obese.
Yep.
But by the standards of that day, they were models. They were ideal, right? They were seen as, wealthy enough to be able to afford enough food to be fat. And being skinny meant you were poor because you didn't have enough food. And then, in modern times where food became mass-produced and access to food became easier for more people, then we shifted that to the idea of thinness is healthy and fatness is unhealthy.
Mm-hmm.
You also have had, just the stigmatization of that word specifically. Fat is like the most offensive thing that you can call people. It feels like, you can call somebody certain kinds of names, blah, 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 like, oh, that sucks, but you call them fat, and it's like, whoa, whoa, and it's one of those words where if a fat person says, I'm fat, our first response is like, oh, no,
Mm-hmm.
you're not,
Mm-hmm.
because we assume that that's a terrible, horrible thing, like, what could possibly be worse than being fat? When in reality, it's just a word that describes their body.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people who say, I'm fat, and I'm going to call myself fat because that's what my body is. And it's not because I think that my body is wrong or bad. My body's healthy. I do the things that I need to do. So if you want that to be a bad word, that's on you. That's not on me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to call myself what I am, and that's fat.
Okay.
So that taking away that stigma that's automatically shoved into that word.
Interesting. So you're just talking about fat as a word instead of fat as a standard or aesthetic.
Yes.
Right. So
both, I think.
Yeah, but let's differentiate them. The
Okay.
first one is I cannot call a person fat.
Right.
But if let's say he is fat,
Right.
but I use a different word,
Right.
is that okay for me to say? Like chubby, big.
That's a classic question. Like, I don't know. We
Okay.
have all of these euphemisms that we use to sound more, it's a kind of political correctness, right?
Yep.
That sound nicer but mean the same thing. So why should
What I'm wondering is just is the thing bad or actually is the
Right.
word bad, right?
And I think the word fat is particularly
for sure.
bad.
Yeah.
But, the idea that other words aren't the same thing is kind of ludicrous.
Mhm.
Like, oh, I'm a full-figured woman.
Or
I'm not supposed to
overweighted,
be
yeah.
offended by that, and yet I know that when somebody says I'm a full-figured woman, what they mean is I'm fat.
Mm-hmm.
But they just don't want to be called out and being rude by using that shameful word.
You even have a brand called
It's-
Big and Tall, which is
Right.
basically try to stay away from.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a Simpsons episode from a long time ago, and it was for the Big and Tall story was called for the rotund and gangly gentleman. And just all of these dumb words that we euphemistically get around. Yeah. So yes, I think the word fat is particularly bad, but I also think all of those other words get at our idea that physical beauty requires thinness.
Okay.
And physical beauty and physical health require, not having excess fat on you. When there's medical evidence, that having a little bit more fat rather than a little bit less fat is good for you.
Yep.
Overall, fat people don't live shorter lives or less quality lives,
Yep.
except for the fact that our society has constructed them as being wrong. So even things like my dad is 6'7", and he weighs a lot. I feel like I can't even say my dad's weight because, scandals, even though I'm arguing that it's all crap. He's a really big dude, and he can't fly. Right? And partly because of the knee room, because he's so tall, but also the seats are about this wide. I'm a relatively normal quote-unquote size person. I'm not excessively large or excessively small. I'm even on the planes like,
Yep.
And so we've constructed that the average body should be this size, so that's how big seats are. If you're I teach in Centennial a lot, and they have these desks with the little the chairs and a little desk that comes over it.
Mm-hmm.
If you are even a little bit overweight, those chairs are uncomfortable. Those desks are miserable because you immediately, like, it butts up to your stomach.
Yep.
So we've created this world that doesn't reflect how humans are. And so then if you're a fat person going into that classroom and you have to sit in that chair, A, you're going to be uncomfortable, and B, you have that stigma of everybody going, oh, too fat for the desk, huh?
But what's the solution to this? Do you have like 3-chair designed just for big people
Maybe.
in the back?
Well, but and then
That
that's
kind
the
of
other
feel bad,
thing, right?
right?
Like,
Yeah.
oh, you have to sit in the fat desk. Right? No, I would say you don't have to have those kinds of chairs and desks. Tables work.
Oh, okay.
You know, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of things we could choose to do differently if we did choose to do things differently. And I'm not, like, crapping on the university here to say that university is fat phobic. I don't think that anybody was thinking about that. But it's a reality that we construct the physical space around us as well as the linguistic world around us.
Same thing
to
with like
privilege certain
lefties
people.
and
And I'm a
righties,
lefty.
right, yeah.
But because I didn't have access to lefty desks, I learned how to be a lefty in a right-handed desk. So I hate left-handed desks.
Interesting.
Even though I'm a
yeah.
lefty.
With more and more
Yeah.
technology, however, they are trying to integrate this kind of thing. For example, if you use iPhone, the
Yes.
first thing they ask you,
Yep.
do you use your left or right hand?
My watch.
Exactly,
I have
yeah.
my little knobby thing over here instead of
Yeah.
up here because it's easier for me as a lefty to do
Yeah.
it there.
I kind of feel like if you increase the scale, now it's the time you start to realize no matter how
Yeah.
minority a group is, that you're talking about millions
Yeah.
of people, or at least 100,000 people here, right?
Yeah.
Then they start to care about this kind of thing, and
Yep.
it's very easy for them to actually do this.
But it requires, again, enough people getting together to say, we want this to change. What these desks are, what this, this euphemistic language that we have for fat people is problematic, and we want things to change, and they have to communicate that message to the right people to make that change happen.
Interesting.
Right. And so if somebody calls me full-figured, which they can, whatever, I have the power potentially to say, I think you mean that I'm fat, and let them feel that uncomfortableness. Like, well, I was trying to be nice. I'm like, yes, you were, and thank you for that. But your niceness is just another way of saying you should be ashamed of your body size, right? Like, I'm saying full-figured because
you should work out.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the fact that the word fat and the word lazy are inherently connected in our culture is totally our culture's decision. Instead of looking at, sometimes people might be fat because they have to work 2 jobs and can only sneak a little snack in here and there that's not nutritious. Maybe it's because they live a 30-minute bus ride to a grocery store that has fresh produce, or they can just go around the corner to the convenience store and get food for cheaper and less nutrient rich, right?
Totally makes
and
sense.
so having access to good quality food requires the time to get to the store and back. It requires the financial means to buy that food. It requires you to have, no other obligations for a half an hour to get to the store and to come home and prepare it. Fatness is tied in some situations to just life. It's not about laziness, it's just about life.
It's the same thing, yeah.
Yeah.
The first time I noticed this was I got a friend who worked out a lot. I was pretty fit when I was in college, and I just played football. I'm not those kind of workout guys. You can see the shape, right?
Yeah.
But he works out, and there was one time we just walked through into something, and he saw a guy. He says, "Well, that guy is rich." I said, "How do you know he's rich? Look at his body."
Oh, interesting.
That says like you need to have a lot of time. That means you don't have to work.
Yeah.
You can spend 7 hours a day, 8 hours a day
In the gym.
in the gym and everything, and you can still support that. You can support the food. You can support the time.
Right.
That means you basically run a company, and people work for you.
And your body is your company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's almost no. Actually, he runs a company, right?
Oh,
so
he
he doesn't have
actually
to
does
work.
run a
He doesn't
I see.
have to actually work 8 hours
see.
a day. I mean, let's
Right.
face it. After 8 hours a day, you go back to your home. Do you want to work
Yeah,
out for another
no.
3 hour?
No.
30 minutes to keep my health
Nobody
healthy,
wants
right?
to do that.
That's
Yeah.
that's the case here. So that's the first time I realized, oh, actually, this is can be a way to
Well-
tell people you're from a certain social class.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think about Hollywood people. Like, everyone's like, oh, I wish I had a body like that person. Like, well, hire a chef. Find 5 or 6 hours again a day
trainer.
to do the perfect amount of exercise, the right amount of weight. Don't hurt your back in the process. Yes, it is access as much as desire for a lot of people.
And so that's like,
Yeah,
that's
and
what I've observed.
but that's also the same for other kinds of physical health issues too. I had a friend, one of my best friends ever. I've always been a little bit larger. It's just a big person, and she's a very tiny person. And she complained about not being able to gain weight. She wanted to gain weight, but just couldn't. And I was young and self-conscious about my body, and I said, "Oh, you're so lucky that you can eat whatever you want and not gain weight." She's like, "I'm not lucky. I want to gain weight. I'm at an unhealthy weight. I have something wrong with me." And so, how I bought into that idea that not being able to gain weight was somehow healthy when we need to have weight. It's fundamental. And then, it ties to other kinds of access to health care. This friend ended up dying from cancer 8 years ago because she didn't have access to good quality health care. Her family chose to feed their kids over paying insurance premiums. He was an independent employee of a small company and didn't get work provided insurance. And so, we make judgments about people going to the doctor or talking about how, health insurance shouldn't be a right, that it's something that you can have, but you don't have the right to have health care. That discourse in our society that you have to deserve health care or pay for health care is a particular construction that has had a really negative impact on my life because I don't have my best friend now. And if we could talk about health insurance in a way that wasn't just about this sort of capitalistic, money-making, for-profit industry, things would be different.
I grew from China.
And
I came here. It's ridiculous. I just had a baby. We were in the delivery room for 1 day, patient room for 2 days. The bill was freaking $50,000 before.
50,000?
Yeah, before insurance. I just if I don't have insurance,
yeah,
done for. The rest, 20 years, 10 years, I will be just paying this debt. And this is just one baby. What if I have a second baby, or I have some health issues? It's crazy.
Just having a baby in your life is expensive. Food and diapers and clothes and all of the things that come with having a baby after you leave the hospital.
That's really crazy.
Yeah, and in our media here, you have these heartwarming stories about how somebody developed cancer and needed to raise money, so they had a GoFundMe page, and everybody was so nice and contributed money, so now they get to live.
With millions of dollars.
We're constructing that as a heartwarming story instead of the tragedy that it is that somebody's ability to stay alive depends on a bunch of strangers sending them $10-20.
And you need a lot of strangers. You need millions of dollars to do that.
Yeah, or
so
one
crazy.
really super rich person.
Yeah.
But that's how we've decided that that's what healthcare looks like here. And instead of saying, I can pay $500 more in taxes every year, $1,000 more in taxes every year, and get government health care, or I can continue to pay that money and then also have all of these other private company issues. Government health care isn't going to solve everything, but if there were a different way of talking about it and talking about healthcare in China or in Canada or in Scandinavia where they are making it work, instead of just saying, well, Canada, they have terrible health care. I'm like, if you actually talk to a Canadian, they don't think they have bad health care.
Yeah, same thing with our education there. That's another big complaint I have for the tuition here. It's just it's crazy.
Yeah. I have been out of school, I finished my PhD in 2008. So I've been paying my loans for 11 years, and I've got 9 years to go.
Wow. Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah. And, you can make arguments for why government should or why government shouldn't, and I think there's reasonable arguments to be made on both sides. But our country's vocabulary about government is that the government is inherently problematic, and that more government has to automatically be bad. Instead of saying, well, what can government do well and what could government not do well?
Yep.
And it's tied to that larger kind of construction we have in the U.S. of, capitalism, which I'm not opposed to capitalism. I think it can do lots of things really well, actually. But the idea that everything has to fall into that line means that we can't have discussions about any other ways that life can make sense. And the idea of this sort of bootstrap theory that, everyone has equal opportunities to succeed, there's no barrier to anybody, blinds us to the structural barriers that do actually exist,
And even for
including
now,
access to
yeah,
healthcare,
American
including
dream.
access to education. Right.
Yeah, American dream is not true anymore. If you're
Yeah.
not so silly, you can see that, right?
Right.
It's just like
And yeah, George Carlin
two
said,
cars, one house. No.
yeah,
it's
no,
not
like
gonna
nobody
happen.
graduating college right now
Yeah.
is able to do that. George Carlin said they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it.
Mhm.
And I'm like,
Basically, yeah. Same thing with with the workout thing. It's just like why do they put such a label on fat? I think it's part of because think about how much the fitness industry make
Yes.
in terms of gadgets like that
Yes.
and gyms. That's the first time I realized. Okay, you pay that much to go to a gym.
Yeah, to run on a treadmill like a hamster.
Yeah.
I used to be in Weight Watchers for a lot of years. I started in 2009, lost about 65 pounds, most of
Wow.
which I've gained back.
How long did it take you to do that?
About 7-8 months.
That's tough.
I went obsessive with it,
Yeah.
and this is the problem. I was rewarded for losing weight, and I was rewarded for the health benefits that I was going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And my body's going to thank me. But it turns out I lost to my target weight, and then I kept losing. And I kept losing to the point where I didn't feel good. I was tired, lethargic. I felt just like my hair wasn't healthy. But I would go to the meetings, they'd be like, oh my gosh, you lost another 1.5 pounds. That's so great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I drank that Kool-Aid. I was like, yeah, super healthy now. Awesome. So much healthier.
Mm-hmm.
And then people started asking me questions like, I was out and some guy goes, you must be a runner. I'm like, oh God, no, I don't run ever. And he says, oh, you just got that gaunt look like a runner. I'm like, you think I look gaunt? And so I was telling my friends, like, yeah, this dude thinks I look gaunt. They're like, well, you kind of do. Like, why didn't you tell me I look too skinny? They're like, well, you were really excited about losing weight and we wanted to be supportive. I'm like, being supportive is calling me out and saying you no longer look healthy because you're thin. But it didn't matter. And then I, just by accident, gained 5 pounds back. And everyone's like, you look really well rested.
Oh, yeah.
You look a lot better.
The
What are you
color of
doing
your
different?
face,
Yeah.
your hair.
My hair was shinier.
Yeah.
I had more energy.
That's very interesting because...
But the Weight Watchers industry makes, and diet plan industry makes big bucks telling people, just keep losing,
Classic
just keep losing.
advertisement and capitalism, right? So I actually didn't know this until I took a psychology class online. That is like, basically words will change your perception of your body. It's really possible for you to think you're healthy, but actually other people look at you and just say it's not. You can really get a wrong impression of how thick your arm is. Basically, there was one patient they were trying to say is just like, the girl was really like a skeleton standing up, but the girl still thinking I'm too fat. And then they need to actually say, hey, put a paper on your thigh, draw the 2 lines across your paper, and take out the paper and see how small that thing is. She actually have to see that to believe she's not fat, because when she sees her leg, her arm, she perceives it differently.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, she can actually see other person say, oh, you are like normal size. She can do all the stuff, but when she perceives herself, it's different. She look at the same thing, she just feel it's big. That was really interesting. That's why I say, like, when you talk about language can put an impact on your fat or not, actually that thing is going to change your perception, and your perception actually change the way you see your body biologically.
Yeah.
That was fascinating.
And that's, for people who use the word fat in a neutral way, that's what they're doing. They're saying, I'm looking at my body and choosing to see my fatness as just a part of my body, not as my failing.
Another
and
thing
if you
is,
can do that, then you're liberated from all of that social pressure to be a Victoria's Secret model.
Another problem is, like, you see too much models nowadays. Like before, what did you know? Now you just like, for example, you are the skinniest girl in that town. Fine. Until you travel out of that town, you will never know how beautiful people can be. But now you just open anything and say, this is a beautiful person. Now, everybody in my working place is not like that.
And they're photoshopped.
Oh, yeah.
Those beautiful thin people, their thighs are still too fat, so Photoshop.
The interesting thing about this is, in psychology, there is something, like whenever you go to a room, right? Let's say the room smells really bad. Your nose got used to it after 1.5 minutes, right? But there are two things experimented, that no matter how much you are exposed to those kind of things, you never get easier. The first one is actually noise. You go into some place, you listen to the noise for 30 minutes, and you say, does it sound less harmful? No, still the same thing. So noise doesn't do that.
Okay.
But the positive one is actually you could never get enough of plastic surgery. It's like you make yourself looks better.
And then you
Up to a certain point, this is what I
Yeah.
observed. Actually, some of the guys or the ladies I know is just like they can't stop. They become obsessed with plastic surgery. It's like, why do you want to do that? You're already good enough.
Right.
When are you going to stop?
Right.
Turns out they never get enough of that psychologically.
Yep.
So,
And it's interesting that it's usually women who go overboard with plastic surgery. Some men do.
same things with
but
the
I
judge,
think
right?
it's-
When people see you, they just judge you that way.
Yeah, and I
because of
think
that
women
different-
are particularly judged by their physical body,
Mhm.
and women are particularly judged for having an aging body.
Mhm.
You
Just
know,
look at Hollywood. How many
Yeah.
mid-aged actors you see? Like there are no stories
Yeah.
written forward. So you either become a mom, or you're a girl, and there's nothing in between.
or you just stop acting. Meanwhile, you know, older men in Hollywood can still be in movies where
actually
the
become
romantic
better.
interest
They
is a
become better.
20-year-old. Yeah,
Yeah, as
Yeah.
like Tom Hanks, Russell
Right.
Crowe. Like when they start aging, that's
Right.
the moment they start to get the Oscars and all this kind of meaningful.
yeah, because they're
Right. If you're like 20 years
distinguished.
old, what kind of movie can you get?
Right.
Right. So.
Yeah, yeah. Older men are distinguished. Older women are.
Yeah, it's just the culture,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah,
Well.
it's the language we have to describe. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move to the next thing.
Okay.
So, tell us a little bit about communications in family.
And family.
Yeah.
Okay. So my dissertation for my PhD was on family storytelling. And I wanted to look at how the process of telling stories about our families give families their particular identity as a family, and how that's connected to larger cultural discourses of being a family, particularly being an American family.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've heard of StoryCorps.
No.
It's a national project. It started right after 9/11. They asked people who had been in New York City or Washington on 9/11, who witnessed the towers falling and stuff, to come in and share their stories about that day. And then it expanded out from there to just be asking regular people to come into the recording booth and speak with somebody important in their lives about their lived experience. Nothing famous, nothing huge, just what is it to be you?
Mhm.
It's a fascinating project. It's now almost 20 years, and the
Well, they
stories,
still keep doing it?
they're still doing
Okay.
it. They have mobile booths that go around, and yeah, it's phenomenal. And so I decided, because I also had an interest in media, and I thought, well, looking at how people tell stories in mediated context will say something about their kind of cultural identity, because they're going to only tell stories that are culturally
Mhm.
relevant or, appropriate. So I went to Washington, D.C. for 7 weeks and transcribed family stories in the StoryCorps database. And the ultimate conclusion was that people have to tell the classic American stories about their family. That involved a lot of immigrant stories about how, our family came here poor in 1901, and by grit and determination, great-grandpa got that business up and running, and they ate rice for years and never had meat and never had vegetables. It was all staples. And then through hard work and persistence, now we have this successful American family that we are. Or stories about stigmatizing things always had to be in the past. Nobody wanted to talk about current stigmatizations in their family. It had to be resolved. So there always had to be that kind of moral of the story. Here's how we overcame the stigmatizing event so that we are still a good American family. Stories about overcoming poverty. Nobody wants to talk about staying in poverty, right? It's always becoming economically successful. And so the long and short of it was, what we do when we tell family stories is we bring people into the culture. That's how little kids learn what it means to be part of this family, but also what it means to be a good family, to be a good American family. And it's through all of those little practices that we do every day without thinking about at the dinner table, at bedtime, while we're cooking dinner. Those are really formative experiences that we have to help us shape what we know and believe to be true and right. So family is kind of the key place where our moral values are instilled as humans.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so then we also talk about in my family comm class how families that don't line up with that sort of cultural script of what a family's supposed to be have extra language work to do. So I have a friend who, she's a woman and she's married to a woman, and they have a son.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if a heterosexual couple gets married and has a son, they're like, oh, great, you're a family. You had a kid. And for my friend and her wife, it's, so which one of you carried it? Is it who's the real dad?
Mm-hmm.
And they have to explain things to people in a way that a heterosexual family doesn't have to. They have to justify themselves, like, well, don't you think he needs to have a man in his life? He's a son. Don't you think that he should have that?
Mm-hmm.
And they have to justify how they're helping their son understand his masculinity, as well as just the other issues of being a kid.
Mm-hmm.
So families that live outside that narrow boundary of what a good family is, or what a normal family is, have all sorts of extra language work to do.
Mm-hmm.
So the other classic example is our culture describes stepmothers as wicked. Like all the Disney movies, it's the wicked stepmother.
Snow White. Yeah.
Right. And Cinderella and all
yeah.
of those. Stepmoms are inherently wicked and mean and hate the children. Like, that's just a common thing. There are movies about it. Stepmom was a movie with Julia Roberts and Susan Sarandon dealing with this sort of issue of the other mother. And so for kids who get along really well with their stepmother, they often have to justify that. It's like, oh, your stepmom. But yeah, she's my stepmom, but she's really, really nice. We get along really well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how does your biological mom feel about that? It's like, well, you know, we don't really talk. And little kids have to kind of figure out how to negotiate liking their step-parent and their biological parent. There's a lot of language work that has to go into that based on what we expect families to look like and sound like, when most families don't look or sound anything like the families that they're supposed to be, right? I grew up in a fairly traditional two-parent house, mom and dad. Dad worked, mom stayed home till I was older, and pretty much what you would consider a normal American family.
Mm-hmm.
And we're so abnormal. Like, it's just that because our abnormalities aren't visible, nobody thinks to question the rightness of our family. But if you're abnormal, it's visible, you have to account for yourself and justify why you're a family.
Both, are you seeing more problems from one type, or actually both type
Yes, both.
are having problems?
Yeah.
But for me, it's very easy for me to identify, because you got two women raising a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I would know there are some justification to do right away.
Mm-hmm.
But how am I supposed to do anything about if a normal family actually have hidden abnormal issues, right?
Yeah, there's nothing we can do unless we're inside it.
Mm-hmm.
And the dark side of that is, if there's abuse but it's not being seen, it's hard to fight that.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have this sort of discourse that family is inherently a private matter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what happens to the family is not for public consumption. And that's okay, except that when there are bad things happening in a family, if nobody can see it, nobody can help fix it.
Mm-hmm.
So little kids can be in a pretty dangerous home environment, but if nobody knows and everybody assumes, well, they have the right to the privacy, you know.
Yeah,
Instead of it takes a village to raise a child kind of policy, brings more things out into the open. And it's not that that's problem-free, but there's a lot more opportunity then for people in violent or hurtful environments to be seen and helped.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
For here, I kind of feel like when I was back in China, for example, like where we were so crowded, like anything happened next door, you will hear it.
Yeah.
Literally, you're going to hear
yeah.
it. So nobody actually can hide that thing for long.
Right.
And eventually your neighbor is going to do something about it. Here it's
Yeah.
kind of like, that's the first time I came here, I saw this like Texas chainsaw and all this kind of thing. You got a whole farm. If I go in, I don't come out, it will take you, I don't know, 20 years to figure out, okay, where did Dr. Chen just disappeared? Right? So I was just like, wow, you're so far away from each other.
Yeah.
I mean, have your privacy, but...
We're so far away from each other physically, but also just emotionally. Americans are so obsessed with individualism and autonomy.
That's the base of the country, though, right?
Yeah, and
that's the culture.
it is, and that's not inherently wrong or bad, but it has a cost that we don't see because we don't have language or a way to describe the costs, really, in a systematic way. Yeah, and, you know, to me, the thought of living so close to my neighbors that they could hear everything I am doing. I grew up in the Midwest where it's wide open spaces.
Yeah.
That freaks me out. You know, I can't even imagine being that close to that many other people.
Yeah.
But if that's what you grow up with, that's what seems normal.
For me, it's just like I really think it's a really good idea to listen to other cultures, right? That's why I came to America and I see, wow, people live in this way.
Yeah.
I already watch a lot of Hollywood movies and a lot of music before I came here, so I thought I knew America. Until I came here, it's just, okay, until you feel it, you still don't know where the foundations are.
For real.
But yeah, I think people should open their eyes, just listen to a little bit more than just what CNN and BBC is feeding.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just start to listen to people, yeah.
Yes, and that's kind of why I liked that StoryCorps. It gives you access to what real people experience rather than, you know, Hollywood is bananas. I studied abroad in
That's
France.
propaganda, right? So
Yeah, 100%.
yeah.
I studied abroad in France when I was an undergraduate, and I heard my little host brother and his neighbor friend talking, and the friend said, "Who is that girl?" And David says, "Oh, that's my American sister." And the other kid goes, "Oh, she's rich." And David goes, "Well, yeah. I'm not rich at all." But their assumption, based on their Hollywood exposure, was that all Americans live in, you know, beach houses and
sunglasses.
and
drive
coasting
a car.
around in our fancy cars. I'm a college student. I don't have crap for money.
Interesting.
And I didn't come for money either.
Okay. Well, that was interesting to hear about families. And finally, we actually got time to cover all of them. So
Yay.
let's talk about race.
Okay.
That's going to be a little bit sensitive.
It's harder.
I have no idea where to pick the boundaries, so you start.
Okay. I don't know where to pick the boundaries either, because I want us to talk about more things, not less things. Right now in America, I think we're seeing what's always been there, but that people hid. So, let me explain what that means. Racism is woven into the fabric of the United States and many other countries. We're not alone on that, alas. It is, you know, with the history of slavery and the history of a lot of other things. Chinese people, I don't know how much you know about the early immigrants to California in the 19th century. I assumed you probably would know something about that. The way we marked Chineseness in that century is still present now.
Yeah.
How we marked blackness in the era of slavery is still embedded in how we think about blackness today. We, as humans, need to categorize things. It's a natural process for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of contexts. But we decided not that long ago in the course of human history that skin meant something other than skin. The idea that skin has a meaning is a total social construction that we now can't see past. And so the way we talk about race, I think we forget that we're not talking about biology, we're talking about sociology. And all of the words that we have get lumped into biology, and assuming that who you are as a Chinese person, yes, there's genetics involved in being a Chinese person versus being me, I'm a white person, or versus a black person, or whatever. There are genetic things, but that those genetic things are small compared to the fact that we're all just human beings trying to live in a world. So I'm trying to draw my boundaries as I talk. I think one of the main things I want my students to understand when we talk about these things is none of this has to be this way. And
keep your mind open.
Yeah.
Very important.
And this, you know, what we're experiencing right now with people in camps on the border, and this idea that people are coming here, they're all rapists and thugs and bad hombres and all of that stuff, that's more than just language. That's doing violence. That's actual overt violence. Words can do incredibly dangerous things, and our vocabulary of race is really, really dark and dangerous.
Yep.
You know, the discourse about the Confederate flag, arguing that it's about my cultural heritage. And yes, but that cultural heritage literally kept people in bondage, and you literally fought a war to keep them there.
Yep.
So you can talk about being proud of being Southern, but that doesn't mean you have to embrace the symbols that literally tried to keep people in bondage. And a lot of my students say, well, if black people get to use the N-word in music, why can't I use it? And helping them understand that words have different power in different contexts. For a white person to use the N-word ties into all of that history of that word being created to hold people down and dehumanize them. It sounds very different from a black person using the N-word with each other, because the black people didn't have the power to oppress themselves, you know.
Yeah, you don't talk to one person using that thing. You're representing a group.
Yes. Yeah. And people say, well, isn't that just political correctness? I'm like, no, it's just being decent and recognizing that those power structures have had a very long and hateful and hurtful history. Mm-hmm. And the words that we use are so intricately connected to all of those bad deeds that we don't get to take that back.
Mm-hmm.
White people don't just get to say, oops, we shouldn't have called you it in a bad way, so now we'll just call you it in a neutral way. Like,
Mm-hmm.
That's not how any of this works. So all of the racial derogatory words that we have, I mean, every racial or ethnic group has a negative derogatory word that's used for it.
Yep.
And that says a lot about human hatred and our fear of other.
I think the fear comes from lack of understanding.
Yes.
It's basically that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand what the media is trying to do. It's just like try to raise this kind of barrier, try to raise this kind of just don't listen to others. We're the one who is saying the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
They have pushed it to a certain boundary that I think, I don't know. I just look at it. I can't even stand looking at CNN or BBC. It's just like, you guys don't know nothing.
No, I can't watch TV news because it is so
So biased.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in complicated ways, it's biased. It's going to talk about what's going to sell or get ratings that they can then sell to advertisers. And what will get ratings are things that are scandalous. So they try to bait people into saying
so they're
stupid,
desperate,
horrible things. Yeah,
to want to basically attract people with the headlines, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
and,
traditional media.
The problem is right now they don't have to look very far for it. I mean, it's in our leaders' tweets, speeches.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so yes, the media inflame it by continually invoking it instead of ignoring it, which might be better. But so my dad had a friend who was African American, and he grew up in the South and then moved to Chicago as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad, being my dad, he asks questions of everybody. He said, so is it easier to live as a black person in the North than it is in the South? And the man said, it's tricky. In some ways, it's easier to be black in the South because in the South, people will tell you they're racist. In the North, people are racist, but they know better than to say it.
Yep.
So they pretend to be nice to you, all the while thinking of you as an inferior.
Until something happens, something slipped through their mouth, and that's how you view me for the
That's how you
past,
think of me.
right? Yeah.
Yep. And I think, people there was a story in Iowa last week, a kid who raised a bunch of money for the University of Iowa Children's Hospital through this sort of viral thing at a football game. He posted a sign to donate money. It was all this great story about this wonderful young man who raised all of this money. And then while researching a story about him for the Des Moines Register, the journalist found some old tweets that this kid had posted when he was 16 that were racist. And so it's two things. One is, this kid still the same person he was when he was 16? Did he fully understand what a jerk he was being at 16? I kind of feel like, at 16 I knew not to say racist shit.
Yeah.
I knew.
Yeah.
So why didn't he? On the other hand, this kid is growing up in a culture where being edgy and using racial humor is seen as edgy. That's sort of cool. right? A lot of comedians say, well, I talk about these taboo topics because I'm
Comedians
edgy.
have to do that, though.
They,
Right, yeah.
They have to be edgy, but they don't have to be crappy about being edgy. Like you think about people like Richard Pryor in the 70s, he was super edgy and talked about race in ways that made people feel very uncomfortable. But he was doing it specifically to make change happen.
Mm-hmm.
He was pointing out the fallacies of racism to make white people say, oh, that's bad, and for black people to say, yeah, we're not going to take that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That was the purpose of his inappropriate, edgy, racially based comedy.
Mm-hmm.
That's really different from a lot of the comedians today, like the guy who got fired from Saturday Night Live. He wasn't doing it to enact social change. He was doing it for cheap laughs.
Because some people want to listen to it.
Yes.
That's the
because using derogatory language makes people go, woo, and they laugh. But what is it accomplishing to use that? Are you trying to show people how gross it is to use that language, how gross our racial structures are? Or are you just going the easiest possible route to a laugh? That's a very different thing.
That makes sense. But for me, I never go too hard on comedians because, I mean, that's what they do. You got good comedians who cares about things they're trying to make an impact. You got some comedians, they just need to feed their family.
True, but if feeding your family requires you to take the cheap shots at a racial minority, then find another career.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you can't be funny without being offensive, then are you really funny? Or are you just going to make people be uncomfortable just for the sake of making them uncomfortable? There are a lot of good comedians out there who don't have to pick on minority groups. It's the idea of punching up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to make a joke, you have to, you punch at the power structure, not at the people who have less agency and power in society. And so making, racist jokes about black people or Chinese people or Asians of any kind or Hispanic people, are you trying to help them, or are you just trying to reinforce that they are different and other?
Yeah, I still think you're thinking too much. Like they just want some cheap laugh. I think that's it.
But
right?
yeah, but why,
the impact is really
like
going that direction.
Your cheap laugh comes at a cost
to
someone else, and that cost is pretty expensive to someone else. So
interesting.
Don't be a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
Find a way to be funny that doesn't cost anybody anything.
Interesting. Yeah, for me, it's more about when I see that, I just say, okay, I stop.
Yeah,
watching the show.
And me too. Yeah, I'll just turn
that's
it off.
Like
and not support
market
them.
is actually going to do the job to make you behave next time. But
But the market isn't, unfortunately, and that's again where we're seeing racism more overtly now.
Yeah.
Because it's being condoned by those with the most.
It's
power.
also like economy, right? If the economy goes down, you lose your job. I mean, you need to find somebody to blame.
Right, and that's another thing about some of these cheap laughs and racism and all of that stuff. White people have a lot of power, but there are a lot of white people who don't have much power, and that's frustrating when they see the other white powerful people, so they have to find somebody to blame, and it's almost always going to be a racial minority.
It's the easiest one because you can identify the target easily, right? Well, I know. I want to target the people who are uneducated. I mean, walking on the street, who do you know are uneducated and who are educated?
Right.
The way they dress.
Right.
But if you just look at color, it's so easy to tell.
Yep.
Then that's where your hatred goes.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's easy and convenient.
Interesting.
Never mind the fact that, if I lived in some of those countries in Latin America where I was being physically threatened, where I had zero food, I had little kids who were starving, I would do just about anything to get somewhere where I could feed my kid. And that's why most of them are coming here. They're not coming here to steal my job or any of our jobs.
They're not they come here, they work, right?
Yeah, and the work they're doing is the work that most people who were born here won't do. Do you want to go pick avocados for 14 hours a day for like $10?
Yeah.
Because you can have that job. You won't, but you can.
Yeah.
But then you're going to go ahead and blame these illegal immigrants. And just the fact that we call them illegal, like defining humans as illegal humans, that's another social construction thing that bothers me. Like, these aren't illegal humans. They're just humans who are trying desperately not to starve or get shot by drug cartels or, whatever.
That's why you can have all this kind of cheap service and cheap food, basically because these guys are working illegally.
And if American businesses were more likely to pay their American workers a living wage, we wouldn't be having some of the problems we have too. Like, it's the idea that the CEO should be making 400 times the salary of the average worker. I'm like, really?
Well,
I'm sure what you do is really hard work, but that doesn't mean that you get to have that much more.
The problem
and not
with
have me call you
nowadays is the economy is not driven that much by labor anymore, because United States basically said explicitly we do not want to be a manufacturer, a production country anymore. We want to take the service part. That's why like more educated people can tend to be more rewarded. With computer, one guy's ability can be amplified for 1 million times. They can generate a lot of value without hiring people. So capital gain become our major growth right now.
Sure.
That can be a really big problem because where are the people are going to go if the country become richer? Yeah. But the peoples are become poorer.
Exactly, and that's what we're seeing. The middle class is shrinking rapidly.
That's the problem. So, well, I think we hit an hour and a half, so that's passed really quick.
Oh, good, yeah, I did. Yeah,
thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
If we got a chance, we would like to interview more on this. But that was fascinating, so thank you so much.
I'm glad. Tell my students that.
Oh yeah, definitely post it online, right?